On the first Easter morning, the women went to the tomb, and there they discovered the resurrection because Jesus appeared to them alive. And so they ran back to where the men were hiding in a room with the doors locked and told them that Jesus was alive. And they weren't sure they could believe that. I mean, it sounded like good news, but they just really weren't sure. And they were confused. They were afraid. And then Jesus appeared in their midst. He appeared to them to convince them that he was alive, that it really was him. And so that's the context for the story I want to read to you from the gospel. And this story comes from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus, or while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood before them, and he said to them, "Peace be with you." And they were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." And then when he said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and he ate it in their presence. And he said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." And then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. He told them, "This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead, and on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning in Jerusalem. And you are witnesses of these things." Now, I'm indebted to Barbara Brown Taylor for some of her insights into this story, because when I first read this story, I was confused. Because the disciples, they're confused, they're afraid, they don't believe Jesus is alive, and Jesus appears to them, and he says to them, "Hey guys, it's me. Don't you recognize me?" And he says, "See my hands, see my feet." Now, I think that is just really odd. Why would he say that? Why didn't he say, "Hey guys, it's me. See my face? Recognize me? Don't you hear my voice? Don't you recognize this voice?" But he didn't say that. He said, "It's me. See my hands? See my feet?" Now, it reminded me of a story about this young man who was in college, and he took a class in ornithology, the study of birds. And it was a pretty easy class. I mean, all they did was, there was no regular tests. They just showed up and kind of went bird watching and hung out. And then at the end of the semester, the professor said, "Okay, we're going to have a final exam. It's going to be pictures of birds, it's going to be pictures, and you have to identify the birds by the picture." And so he thought that doesn't sound too bad, so he studied. And then when the time for the test, he walked to class, and the professor handed out these pages with pictures on them, but it was only pictures of the bird's legs and feet. That was it. And it was just picture after picture of bird legs and feet. And the guy was so angry. And he just wadded up the paper and he threw it against the wall, and he went up to the professor at the desk and he said, "This is the stupidest test I've ever seen in my life. It's impossible to identify these birds by their legs and their feet. This is just, you might as well just go ahead and give me an F." And the professor said, "Well, I can do that. What's your name?" And the young man said, "You tell me." You know, it's kind of weird. We don't normally try to identify people by their feet. Although I know a woman who said that her mother was so bad at taking pictures that all their family photographs are from the waist down. And so you had to learn how to identify people by their shoes. That's kind of the way they did it. And could you imagine wanted posters. Instead of pictures of the person's face, it had pictures of their hands and feet. Suspect has a second toe is longer than big toe, or the little finger on the right hand is crooked. That's not how we normally identify people. Although our hands do say a lot about us. Our hands do distinguish us because all of our hands actually are different. My hands, on this hand, right here, there is a mark that is from when I got stabbed with a pencil in the 3rd grade. Still there. And then on this hand, there's all these scars across these knuckles from road rash that I picked up when I got hit by a car on my bicycle. And there's a finger on this hand that, quite frankly, has not been the same since high school football. So, we look at our hands and they're different. But my hands also conceal one of my very special talents that I bet most of you didn't even know I had this talent. But I'm double jointed in both thumbs, so I can do this, which, when you're in elementary school, makes you really popular. Because kids think that's really cool. Until some kid moves in with double jointed shoulder blades. Then you get cast aside, but I'm not bitter about it. But the thing I like about hands is they don't lie. You can smile when you aren't really smiling on the inside. And, if you're good at that sort of thing, you can smile at people and they have no idea what you're really thinking. Or you can smile and people have no idea what's really going on inside of you. But hands are a little more honest. We get nervous hands, and you get sweaty palms, clenched fists. Hands kind of give us away. I love those Sherlock Holmes stories when he meets somebody for the first time and he shakes their hand and then they leave and he turns to Watson and he tells him what the guy does for a living and how much money he makes and what he had for breakfast, all just from shaking his hand. He could figure all that out. There was a man who lost his father quite suddenly. His dad had a heart attack. And he rushed to the hospital, but by the time he got there, his dad had already passed, and he didn't get to see him. So he didn't get to see him until he went to the funeral home. And when he went in the funeral home, the first thing he did was he went over to the casket, and he got his dad's hand, and he put it in his hands. And he rolled it over and over, because his dad had these big hands, and he had seen his father build a porch swing with those hands. He had seen his father rock a grandchild to sleep with those hands. His father was an automobile mechanic, and he was very, very good at what he did. He took great pride in his work. His garage was spotless. His work was impeccable. And every night before he went home, he took one of those bristle brushes and he scraped his hands and his fingers. But there were always still stains and calluses on them. And that's what his son was looking for. And as he rolled them over, he saw them, and he said, they tried to clean him up, but they couldn't. Those are his hands. That's my daddy. Look at my hands, Jesus said. And they were not the smooth hands of a rabbi or a scholar, but they were the hard, calloused, probably scraped hands of a carpenter. And in those days, carpenters were also stonemasons. So Jesus' hands were the hands of a carpenter and a bricklayer. And he said, see my hands. Don't you recognize them? These were the hands that they had seen Jesus reach out and touch a man who was blind, and then he could see. These were the hands that they had seen Jesus reach out and touch the shoulder of a man with leprosy. These were the hands that they had seen Jesus put on the back of a woman who had been bent over for 20 years, and she stood up straight. These were the hands that Jesus took the hand of a little girl who was dead and raised her to life. These were the hands that they had seen Jesus gesturing with when he taught. These were the hands that they'd seen Jesus take the bread just a few nights ago and break it and give it to them. These were the hands that the Roman soldiers drove spikes through, and the scars were still there. And Jesus said, "Don't you recognize me? See my hands?" And then he said, "See my feet. Don't you recognize these feet? I mean, you've been following them around for years now. I mean, they left fishing boats and tax collector tables and everything else to follow those feet. For 3 years, they followed those feet all over the place, telling people that God loved them. They followed those feet into Samaritan territory, where they had always been taught not to go. They followed those feet into a cemetery where there was a crazy guy running around, but Jesus wanted to go and heal him. Those were the same feet that they followed into Jerusalem, and Jesus followed him right up to the temple, where he took those feet and kicked over the tables of the money changers. They're the same feet that Jesus, the Pharisees had brought this woman who was caught in adultery and threw her down on those feet. These were the same feet that a woman came and knelt and cried her tears on them and took her hair and wiped them and put perfume on them and loved those feet more than any of his disciples ever did. And they had big scars on them as well, where the spikes had been driven through, big red, angry scars. And Jesus said, "It's me. See my feet. Don't you recognize them?" See, I think it's an odd resurrection story. I mean, on Easter, we want to talk about this one event that changed the history of the world and changed our lives for eternity. We want to talk about this huge cosmic event. And there's Jesus talking about hands and feet, of all things. But once again, I guess Jesus understood something that sometimes we're slow to grasp, is that our hands and feet tell more truth about us than our lips and our smiles, really. The disciples were afraid. They knew Jesus was dead. They couldn't believe he was standing in front of them. They weren't sure if it was really him. And the evidence Jesus gave them that he was alive and that the resurrection was real was, "See my hands, see my feet." And after spending 40 days with them and teaching them, he ascended to heaven. And so you and I can no longer see his hands and feet because his body is no longer here. But when he left, he said, "From now on, those of you who are my disciples, those of you who are my followers, you're going to have to be my body. You're going to have to be the hands and the feet that people see." And so that includes every one of us who consider ourselves a Christian, who consider ourselves a follower of Jesus. He was talking to us. People see his hands and his feet through our hands and our feet. And right now, there are people all around us who are afraid. It seems like these days our culture is just permeated with fear. And of course, certain politicians make sure they keep it going. And some people are confused. A lot of people don't believe, they're not sure they believe the resurrection ever really happened. They're not sure they really believe that Jesus is alive. And since he's no longer here in a physical body, they look to us. And They've seen us smile and pretend we have all the answers, when on the inside we're just as frightened and anxious as anyone else. They've seen us judge people with our pious morality and then jettison it when it becomes inconvenient for us. They've heard us talk about love, but then our actions haven't always lived up to what we say. And so they aren't buying it. They don't believe there ever could have been a resurrection. They don't believe Jesus could possibly be alive because they don't see anything that tells them that it could be. But what if? What if we showed them Jesus' hands and feet? What if our hands were just open in generosity to those in need? What if our hands remained unclenched when people insulted us and made fun of us? What if they saw our hands reach out to the shoulder of a man or a woman that everyone else has written off? What if our hands were always reaching out to those around us? And what about our feet? What if our feet went to stand beside a person who's going through a hard time? What if our feet took us to places where we could serve others? One of the things you learn is that sometimes if you stick your hands and feet out there, there are some people who will drive nails through them for your effort. But what if we did it anyway? And what if we didn't withdraw them when it became painful and we had a price for doing it? I'll tell you what I think would happen. I think more people would believe in the resurrection. I think more people would believe that Jesus is alive. I think we would hear people saying things like, I wasn't really sure about this whole resurrection Jesus thing, but then I saw his hands in one of his followers who came over and put his hand on my shoulder and told me he would be there no matter what. I wasn't sure I believed until I saw his feet and one of his followers who walked over and stood by me when I went through one of the hardest times of my life. And somehow, in the midst of that, I felt his presence. And I know that he's alive. The disciples believed Jesus was alive, not when they saw his face or heard his voice, but when they saw his hands and when they saw his feet. And I believe it's the same for us. People aren't going to believe Jesus is alive because of what we say or how we smile. But people will believe Jesus is alive when they see his hands and they see his feet through our hands and through our feet. So today we celebrate the resurrection. And we'll go back out into a world that's confused, that is fearful, that is disbelieving. So go and show everybody Jesus is alive. Show them your hands. Show them your feet. Amen.